Well, Joseph, welcome to London.
Thanks very much.
Welcome to St Pancras, which is this is the entrance to this magnificent station, which has been renovated for the Eurostar service. And one day maybe we'll have free open travel between here and the continent, and you'll be able to walk straight in there and onto the train and off it. And wouldn't that be wonderful?
That would be wonderful, and from here up to the north of England, of course, as well.
Well, I hope we'll have a service up to the north of England that will not have to come into here, and we'll have through trains that go all the way through.
Yeah, so without stopping here in London.
Yeah, and that must be the ambition. I think there's a demand for it too.
What was the original destinations that were served out of St.
Well, there was a sleeper service and a day service planned.
Yeah.
Certainly Manchester, probably Glasgow, York or something. The sleeper trains, of course, were never used here and sold to Canada. Why they can't be used here, heaven only knows. But the railway cord in from the portal here onto the North London line is still there, and it could operate tomorrow. All it needs is a little bit of signalling.
Yeah.
And so we don't have to wait for high speed 2 or anything. We could run the trains through using the existing Eurostar trains. But we've got to put the pressure on for that as well.
So it's a political question.
Absolutely, yeah.
So if we now welcome Josef Doppelbauer, the Executive Director of the European Agency for Railways. So Josef, welcome to London.
Thank you, Gavin.
I suppose one of the questions might be, making rail work for society. Now, did you invent that term?
No, that slogan did exist a long time before I joined the agency, but I liked it from the beginning, and I also think it's still the essential motto that is behind all the activities of the agency.
Well, it's very, very important. Now, you're a physicist.
From training, yes.
From training, and of course with Alcatel and Bombardier, you had a lot of experience with technical questions and rail included. But tell me, as an Austrian, does it actually help you to bring together 28 countries, or 27, to a common strategy?
Well, if you refer to history, I believe the Austrians have lived in a multinational empire with many languages for many centuries, and there is still a certain diplomatic attitude to the Austrians, and in particular in Vienna, because they always needed to combine the different views of different nations. So I believe that is quite helpful indeed. And coming from a small country, you are not tempted to believe that there is no world outside your country. You are always quickly hitting at borders, so you know that you have neighbors and you have to work with your neighbors.
Well, I remember speaking to someone in Prague, in fact, and he was telling me, of course, where we were sitting in Prague was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And that is now, what was then the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, is now 15 countries, which is really remarkable when you think about it. And interestingly, it's created 500 ambassadors. I don't know if you're aware of that, but
no,
it's
job creation.
Exactly, job creation, I suppose. Yes. Now, I think it's very interesting. The job of the agency. It was obviously in 2001 when the white paper started, and you went through the various railway packages. Looking at your predecessor or predecessors, is your job different to the one that they had?
I believe my job is indeed different, because my predecessor, and there was just one, Marcel Freslupe, he had the job to build up the agency, and he has done a great job, because the agency has been established, well placed, not just physically in Valenciennes in the north of France, but also established as a respected European body. Now, my job is to go to the next level of the agency, because with a new legal package, the so-called fourth railway package, the role of the agency changes, and it changes in a very, would say, significant manner, because we will, as of June 2019, become an authority that will have the mandate to issue authorizations for vehicles and certifications for railway undertakings. What I'm quite often referring to is that the fourth railway package as such is the most important piece of railway legislation ever. It is so important because for the first time it changes from a purely national approach, so you had in the past and until today purely national responsibility for authorization, for supervision, for operation. And with the fourth railway package, for the first time in history, there is an entity, the European Union Agency for Railways, and this entity is in a position to issue a vehicle authorization that is valid in several member states of the European Union.
But it's interesting, are you going to see national governments prepared to cede authority for decision making to the agency? And I suppose I've got that in two phases. One, with the sort of northern European countries, the original members of the EU, as compared to the new members coming in from the east. Are you going to see a two-tier evolution to common regulation?
I don't think we can see a two-tier approach. What I see is a fragmented approach, because several member states have their own approach to it. And what is interesting is that, and we are coming back to the two tiers now, there is the rational approach, which basically is that you have a legal text, and the legal text very clearly says that if the application is for an area of use that includes more than one member state, the application has to go to the agency. So everyone from the rational perspective clearly understands that meaning. But when it then comes to the real emotional understanding that as of 16th of June 2019, a vehicle could appear on German or Italian track that doesn't have the authorization by Eisenbahnbundesamt, but that carries an authorization from the agency, and the authorities in the respective countries have to accept that as a matter of fact. I believe that has not yet mentally fully materialized. There is still this last couple of miles of understanding that as of June 2019 the world will be different. And some of the very specific national processes that one country inspects every vehicle that appears on their tracks for the first time, this practice can no longer be continued because the fourth railway package tells differently.
So we've got to get the psychology
exactly
moving it. I mean, I noticed one of the remarks you made that, of course, technology is moving at a pace in advance of the regulatory environment. How do you see that playing out? I mean, if we look, for example, I was here at London International Shipping Week. There's now an acceptance we're going to have unmanned ships to a degree.
Yeah.
And ultimately we may go to ships which are driven by artificial intelligence. So there is within the industry this great belief that the digital age is absolutely here and that there's an acceptance that it will happen. Do you see that process occurring in rail in just the same way, that all of a sudden will come to a date when people say, actually, the world has really changed?
Well, I see it happen, but what I also see is that rail is, and at least in comparison to other modes of transport, always very slow in adopting new phenomena, new rules, new technology. And this is also why we at the agency earlier this year, we have felt the need that we need to work on the emotional side of the matter. So this is why we went out to Europe, why we had these regional conferences, and for us,
like the one in, was it Bruges? When you
we had
yeah.
no, we had 6 conferences in total. 5 regional ones, one in Budapest, one in Helsinki, one in Amsterdam, one in Malta, and one in Berlin, and then we had a central conference in June in Brussels.
Right.
But we deliberately didn't want to have these conferences focusing on the technical or procedural aspects. We wanted the conferences to start from the why are we doing this. So we are coming back to your statement at the beginning, making rail better for society. We believe that rail is, on the one hand, a very efficient means of transport, and on the other hand, it's very sustainable, environmentally friendly. And we coined the phrase that we want to create the single European rail area. And for the single European rail area, we created the 3 adjectives: safe, connected, and affordable. So safety first, because we believe one of the essential advantages of rail is that it is a very, very safe mode of transport, and it is our mandate to contribute to improving the safety of railways in Europe. Then we believe rail is connecting people, but it is also connecting peoples. So we, as we are here in London, would possibly also want to discuss a bit about Brexit. But yes, from my perspective, rail is there to connect people, and we need to make sure that we don't have barriers. And we should do our utmost, and this is in the mandate of the agency, to break down these barriers. And last but not least, rail needs to be affordable, because if it is not affordable, then rail will lose the competitive battle with other transport modes.
But why do you think rail has been so slow to adopt new technological innovation? I mean, is there a historical reason for this?
Well, there is a historical reason and there is a systematic reason to it. The historical reason is, of course, that when a transport mode is deeply rooted in the 19th century and you have acquired experience over now almost 2 centuries, then you form the mindset. So that's the one aspect. But the other aspect is rail is a network, and it is an interconnected networks of the tracks, of the signaling systems, of the communication systems, of the vehicles, of the locomotives, of the wagons. And you cannot simply change one element of this system without either making it very difficult to integrate with the rest of the system or without impacting the rest of the system. So you have to consider the network aspects of innovation, which, and this is why I coined the phrases soft innovation and hard innovation. Some innovations are soft. You can do it quite easily. If, for instance, you want to change the brake block on one wagon from cast iron to composite, you can do it for that particular wagon and you don't impact the rest of the system. But if you want to change the track gauge of one wagon, you would immediately see that you can no longer run that wagon. Or take the other example, when you change the energy supply, say from steam to electrification, a steam locomotive can continue to run under the electrical wire, but an electrical locomotive cannot run on non-electrified stretches. So there is this inherent system aspect of rail that also makes it more difficult to change.
Is it maybe, well, in fact, there's two questions came out of that. If you look at shipping, it goes back to the time of the Phoenicians.
In fact, yes.
In the case of rail, it's really quite young. It's only 2 centuries old. So maybe that's another reason?
Well, take the comparison to shipping, and we could also take the comparison to aviation. So shipping, the only interoperability issue that you would have is in ports. Because when you're out in the open sea, then you have, except for some ground rules to avoid collisions, but there is very few restrictions. But also in shipping, you had a major transformation that happened in the 1950s and from then onwards when the containers were introduced.
In 1956, yeah.
Yeah, so
Mr. McLean.
and this dramatically changed the way ports operated. It dramatically changed the number of people that were needed, and it dramatically also changed how shipping interfaced with the other transport modes, because now, of course, rail also has to be able to transport those containers.
So, and I suppose a lot of railways were established for military purposes originally as well. And we're ending up with a structure which was partly motivated by military purposes. Would that be true?
Well, I believe that's another aspect. Railways always did have connections to military because it was an essential element to rapidly deploy your troops, and at the same time you wanted to avoid invasion by foreign armies. So I believe, and I'm not 100% sure whether this is true, but why you have a different track gauge, for instance, in Spain or in Russia, this has been one of the reasons. But if you look into the history of the Second World War, the different track gauge didn't help at all, because you had the pioneers, the engineers who rapidly converted the track. So I believe,
and I suppose Barcelona into France is now
converted to European gauge. So, but the mentality is still there that it's a kind of a national system, and
so these are all the barriers in a way to the evolution that you're talking about. In fact, in many ways, leading.
Yes, and then we have another barrier, which is also between the practicalities on the one hand and the more emotional aspects. That's language. You mentioned shipping, and I mentioned aviation. Both shipping and aviation use one language globally.
I was at the meeting, and I thought you were very diplomatic with our friends from France. To the management board. Where is that now?
Well, the point is that as of now, the operation of the railway network in each member state is in the local language. So as long as you stay within one member state, you can operate without any problem. The problem starts when you cross borders. Now, coming to a situation where we would use one common operational language, I believe this has to be the vision ultimately, because otherwise we will always be at disadvantage against the other transport modes. Now,
so it's a competitive
it's a competitive issue. A lorry can run without any issues from the Ukraine to Portugal. The lorry driver possibly comes from Kazakhstan, doesn't speak any of the European languages, but he is still able to read all the road signs because they are harmonized, and he has his device, his iPad, where he gets the essential instruction in his language and where he can also call up the translations if he needs to communicate to anyone. So On the roadside, there is no language barriers. In rail, we have language barriers at every border. So this is the story of languages for rail operation, but you referred to the language of the agency. As a matter of fact, we, for the time being, have no official language, meaning we have to support all 24 official languages of the European Union. We have tried twice in our management board, and we have not succeeded in both cases, because as unanimity is required and one member state has voted against the proposal, we have not yet been able to establish an official working language for the agency.
Does that mean, in fact, that one of the weaknesses of the European Union, perhaps, is this absolute majority of all member states? I mean, how could you possibly, with the different cultures in Europe, how could you possibly get everyone to buy in to something? Why not just a simple majority?
Well, I would say the voting rules of the Council, where you have to have a qualified majority, and qualified majority means 65% of the European population represented by these member states, that's acceptable, because in order to get the blocking minority, meaning 35% of European population, at least 4 member states, this requires some effort. But unanimity is always very problematic, because there will always be one member state who can, for one reason or another, block a decision. So in the case of the language regime of the agency, we unfortunately have unanimity prescribed, and therefore
it could be a constraint to future...
It is, because for the time being we have one member state voting against, but it could be any other member state for some obscure political reason, just...
Well, I mean, we'll come to Brexit, because obviously we must. But do you see, for example, with Brexit, because I'd like to go back to 2 other points in your ministry, if you care. With Brexit, will English lose its importance if Britain eventually does leave the EU? Will English lose its dominance for international transport?
In my view, absolutely not, because the reason why we all speak and use English is not because the UK is in the European Union. The reason is that English is the most widely spoken language in Europe for first and second language, with almost 50% of the European population being able to speak English, and that will remain. And the other reason why English is so important is that most of the technical literature and most of the literature related to technology also comes in English, and this is not through the UK, it's coming from America, but also globally. So that does not change with Brexit. And furthermore, if we look into the languages spoken in the European Union after Brexit, so the dominant language for native speakers, first language would then be German, but the dominating language for first and second language would still be English.
Still English. Now, just before we go to Brexit, you've got a span of control of 7, and Mr. Guido is obviously responsible for ERTMS. How, when you look at your working week, how do you split your time between the 7 areas or functions of the agency? Do you spend more on technical, or do you spend more on really behaviour patterns of people and stakeholders and countries?
Now, let me start from the end. I think I spend most of my time with stakeholders. And stakeholders in member states or stakeholders in representative bodies, representing railway operators, representing freight operators, representing industries. Then in terms of topics, I would say there is 2 important topics that take most of my time. Clearly, the transformation of the agency and the introduction of the fourth railway package, this is more than 50% of my time. But then, as you have referred to Pio Guido here, ERTMS comes as close second, because that's another important topic. But what I also have to say is we are working well together in the agency, and we are also trying to shape a strategic approach to all these matters and to develop the strategies together.
I mean, again, before we go to Brexit, if we go to the job of the agency and we go to, for example, 10T, I invited Professor Balash to Glasgow to talk in a seminar of stakeholders about the role of 10T. Now, 90% of the people I had there had never heard of 10T. They had no clue what 10T was, and by general acclamation, 10T has been a great success for the Commission. How are we going to get across to the user of rail freight, number one, that the agency exists, number two, its purpose and its objective, and number three, to get people just to understand there's a complex regime out there of regulatory demands, of technical standards. How are we going to get across to people the real importance of what you're doing?
I believe the only way of getting the message across is talking to people. And I believe freight and freight operators is relatively easy, because most of the actors involved, they have at least an understanding of some of the regulatory issues, and as soon as somebody operates across borders, he is immediately faced with challenges and problems, and then they immediately are looking for solutions. And to have one European authority to managing these cross-border issues for them is obviously a positive thing. But just giving one example, last week I was in Germany to attend a meeting of essentially freight operators. And there you clearly see the need for explanation, to explain what does it mean to have a new regime of vehicle authorization. What is in the new regime the roles and responsibilities of the authority that authorizes the train? What's the responsibility of the railway undertaking? What is the responsibility of the infrastructure manager?
Well, quite, because if you look at the Freight Leaders Forum members, a lot of our members are shippers, of course, and we have members in 17 different countries. But I was quite disappointed. I mean, Ralph Charlie Schultz is, of course, on the management board, and I am his deputy in terms of the freight representation. Yep. But most of them had never any real understanding of the certification of vehicles, the importance of safety certificates. It didn't strike them. They just wanted the price, come back to your competitive point, they wanted the transit time. We've got an awfully big job to do, I think, to get across the broader picture to the people that use rail freight.
And here again you hit the essential element. People don't understand why we have created that framework, why an authorization is needed. And of course, this is rooted in the safety aspect, because the history of rail has been a history of innovation, but it has also been a history of, I was even tempted to say, catastrophic accidents.
Yes,
and
yes, indeed. Well, you've got the statistics, of course, of accidents for both passengers and freight throughout Europe, and the different results by different countries. So presumably that speaks volumes.
That speaks volumes, and it is our responsibility, together with everyone else working on the railway system, to transport our passengers safely and to transport our goods safely and to avoid damage to property and to the environment, for instance, when transporting dangerous goods.
Exactly.
And this is why authorization exists, this is why safety certification exists, and this is why supervision exists.
Well, I mean, that's terribly important. I mean, noise regulations are going to be a very big issue, but that's global, of course, because that is common regardless of which country you're in, I'm assuming. So
Well, noise is a very interesting subject because, first of all, noise is on the border between being just what I would call a comfort issue and being an important issue for the impact of rail on the environment. We have now got some member states in the European Union where noise or rail noise is considered public enemy number one.
Germany?
Germany being one, but Netherlands
Equally.
Now, if we talk to some other member states, take the Nordic countries, the usual argument is our wolves and bears don't care about rail noise. We don't have a problem.
It's a fair comment.
Yeah. So now finding a technical solution is one point, but we are again here in the area of emotions, in the area of acceptance. And we need to sell to the audience that actually the overall benefit by shifting transport volume to rail outweighs the occasional environmental
question. Well, let's go to Brexit before I come back to some other points about contingency planning,
Yes.
which I've been suffering from over the last 12 or 15 hours. Brexit, for some of us, terribly disappointing. What's the consequence on A, the agency, and B, in the goals of the agency of Britain coming out of the European Union?
Well, on the one hand, as per our mandate, we are the European Union Agency for Rail. So the consequence for us would be that the UK, as it is no longer part of the European Union, would no longer be subject to our technical specifications for interoperability, and we would no longer have the right to include the UK in an area of use for safety certification and vehicle authorization. But if we look closer, then we are now more and more thinking within a global perspective. So in terms of the technical standardization, we are approaching the matters from the perspective of what we call the global reference. ERTMS being one example where at the moment I believe we still have more kilometers of ERTMS outside the European Union than inside the European Union. And there are some other aspects where the aspiration of our work has to go beyond the European Union. We have a close interaction with an organization that is called OTIF. OTIF is an organization of around 50 countries, including the European Union, including the UK, by the way. And I assume the UK will remain in OTIF. So this is one.
And I hope the Council of Europe, I hope that's not going to change.
That should also be the case. Now, if the UK remains within OTIF, then there is an easy way for the UK to recognize our authorization and to recognize our technical specification for interoperability because they are transposed in OTIF.
And do you think, for example, that officials in the Department for Transport are consciously thinking in that way? Or have we got to lead them a little way in this direction?
I have no frequent contact with the officials in the DOT, but I have rather frequent contacts with the sector representatives in the UK. And from my discussions with the sector representatives, I gather that this is indeed the way of thinking of the UK sector,
and we
at
have
least.
to do everything we can to promote that.
Yeah, I believe it's in the
Interests.
full interest of the UK users, because they get access to a global pool of technology, and it's also in the interest of the UK industry, because the markets are global and you cannot just restrict your technology, your ambitions to a small market if the competition, and here I'm including competition from Far East, thinks in a global perspective.
Well, I'm very interested in one remark in your papers that you see the agency as setting the world standard.
Well, we use always global
a world
reference.
standard, yes. I mean, that came out in a very strong way to me. Now, if it's the world standard, then we're going to see China maybe starting to follow, maybe India, the subcontinent, maybe parts of the Middle East. Iran is building its rail network. So this standard, you're almost saying, is the template for global rail.
Yes, this is what we believe should be the case indeed. If we again look to the concrete example of ERTMS, then it is exactly as you were saying. China are following the European standard, India are following the European standard, the Gulf countries are following the European standard, but we have to be very careful though. The challenge is that Europe remain in the lead.
Absolutely,
And
technologically
and
patterns, yeah.
We already are faced with situations that some standardization activities are driven by actors coming from outside Europe, and then we have to just adopt by the normative power of facts what is coming from outside Europe, which is obviously not the preferred solution for us.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've been invited to be a keynote speaker at this major logistics conference in Tehran at the beginning of November. And it's quite a task. I spent 2 years there just at the end of the previous political structure. And interestingly, the population has doubled since I left Iran in 1978 to today, which is not a long time. And I suppose the reason I'm mentioning that is, and Iranian government ministers are by far the majority of the speakers that will be there. What advice have you got for me that I should include? And don't necessarily answer now, but what should I be talking about the agency as a global standard that Iran, for example, would be wise to follow?
Well, I can give you one bit of advice. I was in Iran last year, and what I noted was that all people we met from the sector were very, very well informed about the European system and about our technical specifications for interoperability. I even had to admit that oftentimes they knew the European regulation better than ourselves.
Really?
So they are extremely well informed, and at the same time, the Iranian responsible managers and directors of the ministry and Iranian rail, they are very well aware of, firstly, the geographic and strategic position of Iran between China and Europe, and as alternative to
road and all these things.
And they are also very well aware that it is not the right thing to depend on just one partner. In the past, during the sanction period, they strongly depended on the Chinese, but they clearly told us we don't want to become dependent entirely on just one foreign partner. So Iran globally are very open to participate in this framework of global reference.
Well, that's very, very good to hear, and very encouraging, especially with One Belt, One Road, which is going to be the big dominant feature. But you see, again, I come back to the simple point. when I was president of an organisation last year, a major benevolent organisation in Scotland, I was mentioning the Silk Road. And the majority of people around me said, Rosa, what are you talking about the Silk Road? It's got nothing to do with us here. And I said, excuse me, gentlemen, not true. You know, it's a global issue. And it comes back to your point all the time, that we're looking for global solutions.
Well, and just coming back to the One Belt, One Road initiative, this is the most important political and economic initiative of our times. And there is huge amounts of money spent, and there is massive political power behind all these ambitions. And it's just happening before our eyes, and it has a dramatic impact on the way the freight is going to be distributed in a couple of years.
Oh, for sure. I mean, and we look at it with parallels with the aerospace and obviously with maritime. I think one of the concerns I've got, looking in many ways from the outside in, is that a lot of the general population do not have a particularly detailed knowledge of what's going on in the world today. For example, with Brexit, I really don't think the issues were debated. If we'd had a result that we got, and we'd had an intellectual discussion on the real issues, consequences of withdrawing from 10T, consequences of the cooperation that we will cease to have, consequences of the fact that we're within Europe geographically, we're in the Council of Europe politically, and yet we come out of the EU. But I don't think most people understood the real consequences. And you could almost say in parallel that a lot of rail freight users don't yet totally understand the role of the agency. So is it the same story?
You're absolutely right, and it's exactly the same story. And I believe you can never communicate too much. And wherever I go, I realize that there have been several people involved that have not understood what is really at stake. And you have to go out, you have to communicate, and you have to speak to people.
So we've got a big job to do.
We have got a big job to do, and it's important to really disseminate, to demonstrate, but to also to demonstrate what does it mean in practical terms. What is it that contributes positively to the...
Well, I mean, I think European Freight Leaders, which the forum was established in 1994, and it's one of the few... Well, first of all, it's not a lobby group, which is terribly important.
Yeah.
And secondly, it's one of the few bodies in Europe which is non-profit. And so we don't have an agenda except best practice, a think tank in aspects of the global supply chain, and our job is to communicate. So it might be very useful to have different members of the agency coming to our meetings, because again, it's not in any way a lobby group. Brian Simpson, who's Motorway to the Sea, is coming to our meeting in Antwerp in November, where we will discuss the physical consequences of Brexit, not the politics, the physical impact on the supply chain of Brexit. Brian is going to be there, so it might be very useful to have different people from the agency coming to our twice annual meetings, just to inform and realise the gap that exists between some of our members, including the LSPs, on what the agency is striving for.
I could not agree more.
Well, I mean, that's just so welcome. And again, of course, a lot of people here don't realise that DG Move is not a big organisation compared to other structures, but that's maybe another conversation. Let's go back, if I will. There was a remark made by President Juncker, which said, was it people first, or society, or stakeholders first? Something like that. And it reminded me of Trump's America first.
Yeah.
Now, with evolving technology, with the digital structures that are emerging, what are we going to do with the people? because we've got two categories. In London Shipping Week, it was stimulating, like going to university, hearing all this talk of technology and innovation and physical capability. But no one mentioned the impact on people. Lots of people work in semi-skilled jobs and are quite happy to work in semi-skilled jobs. They don't need to be doing big jobs. And for the people that are very technically aware, they will do other things in the technical sphere. But are we looking, how are we going to govern a world of 7.2 billion people, growing to 9.5 in 2050, in terms of the employment opportunities at all levels, from down to up?
I believe this is one of the key issues of our time, and we have several challenges here. The one is what is called the digital revolution. I am not going that far to call this a revolution, because digital technology has existed since quite some time, and we are now just seeing more and more applications and more also threats to the jobs of people, because some of the activities that, as you mentioned, are currently carried out by semi-skilled people will in the not too distant future be done automatically by the digital network. But we have the other aspect as well, that we have people that are more mobile and people that see a huge discrepancy in income, in wealth, and this is one of the root causes of the migration issues. Here issues come together. We live in a globalized society, we live in a society that...
And that won't change?
I believe it will not change. It will change that the pace gets perhaps even more intense in the next couple of years, and it will, in my view, be one of the top problems that we in the European Union but beyond have to tackle. And if you look at the President Trump problem, I believe it's another aspect coming with this separation between the high-skilled knowledge society in the metropolitan areas and the rural or old-style industrial areas where people seem to be lost or even seem to be forgotten.
Well, we've had it here in the UK. I mean, there's quite a lot of criticism here about our nuclear submarine program. But people quite often forget that the skills we've got in building these magnificent machines are retained here whilst we are doing these things. And there's a risk we'll lose these skills. And that would be serious for the UK, in my view. But, I mean, I think, so the people element, the social element is going to become major and presumably part of your mission.
Well, it is, coming back to the beginning, it's in our mission because we have to see how rail fits into the society and how we can contribute to making the society better. That's in the end our mission.
I mean, I think that's something we've got to communicate. So I think protectionism clearly is maybe a phase we're going to go through.
Well, on the issue of protectionism, actually I'm not entirely on one or the other end of the discussion, because it is true that isolation and nationalistic approach are not going to help.
No.
Because we are in a connected world, we have to work together, we have to cooperate. But at the same time, if we refer, for instance, to the challenges that come from the Far East, we also need to have the same conditions for everyone. And here we need to have what is called reciprocity. So that reciprocity. So we need to have the same conditions here in Europe that Europe faces elsewhere. We should not naively open all our borders, and if we go out to the other areas of the world, to China or Japan, and then we would face massive barriers for our own products.
Exactly. Well, look, just a final question, because we're running out of time. So many exciting things to talk about. In ERTMS, will we get to a stage where a driver can get on a train in London, or Glasgow even better, and drive all the way to Milan, and just one driver sleeps, one driver drives, just like a truck? Will we ever get to that?
That is our vision, and this is clearly the ambition that the agency has. Or I would even put it the other way around. If we don't achieve this vision, then we have failed.
Joseph, thank you very much.
Well, Gavin, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much.